Now, as I pointed out in the last segment, the question of what is sexual harassment is perhaps one of the most difficult parts of the question about morality regarding sexual harassment. And the issue really is, as we're going to see in a second, sexual harassment is taken to mean various things, and depending on what it is being taken to mean, it has different, well, you would evaluate the actions in a different fashion. But let's just go through them. First one, and the first one comes out of a, a book, Back Off: How to Confront and Stop Sexual Harassment and Harassers. It's done by the DC. This actually comes out of the DC Rape Crisis Center. And that's how it's quoted in the book. And it says sexual harassment, most broadly defined, refers to unwanted imposition of sexual requirements in the context of a relationship of unequal power. Okay, now there are a few things that you got to think about there. What's the imposition of a sexual requirement? What makes it wanted or unwanted? And what's a real relationship of unequal power? These are a couple things that you probably should stop the video right now and write down what you think they are, because they're really hard to make sure we have a clear idea on. The second one, let me see. The second one comes. Oh, I'm sorry. The definition that's coming up came out of that book from the definition of DC Rape Crisis Center. The first one was from a book on sexual harassment of working women, a case of sex discrimination. It's a book written by Catherine A. McKinnon from 1979. Okay, but come up to this one. It's sexual harassment is the use of words, gestures, bodily actions, or other means of verbal and nonverbal communication to insult, degrade, humiliate, or otherwise dehumanize women. Okay, and notice there are a few things. Sexual harassment, according to this definition, it's the use of words. One of several things. It could be the use of words. So I guess if you use some terms, some derogatory terms for women denoting that they're only good for sex or something, I guess that constitutes it. I guess if you did the same thing for men, but notice here they end up saying to dehumanize women. Gestures, I guess you can make a certain kind of gesture, or a bodily action that's meant to do these other things. And it could be other means of verbal and nonverbal communication. You're wondering what constitutes nonverbal communication. And it's to insult, degrade, humiliate, or otherwise dehumanize women. Well, notice sexual harassment, according to this definition, can only be perpetrated against women. And it's these use of words, gestures, etc., to insult, degrade, or humiliate, or otherwise dehumanize women. And I think the dehumanization is an interesting characterization. Let's go on to the third one, which comes from an Equal Opportunity Employment Commission guidelines on discrimination because of sex. Okay, which says sexual harassment is defined as any action occurring within the workplace whereby women are treated as objects of male sexual prerogative. Okay, interesting one. That's treating people in a certain fashion. Next one coming out of it's an essay in a book by Linda Lemonchek and James Sturber. I know James Sturber is a philosopher, called on sexual harassment. And this is from a piece by Lynn Farley, Sexual Shakedown, the Harassment of Women on the Job. It says sexual harassment is best described, let me make sure I'm looking at the right one, is best described as unsolicited, non-reciprocal male behavior that asserts a woman's sex role over her function as a worker. Okay. interesting. Function over a worker, and I guess people sometimes today talk about sex workers. So I guess if you're a sex worker, this doesn't apply. Not clear. That's not necessarily a problem with the definition. Okay, the fifth one comes from uh, the same book, but different essay by Jan Crosswaite and Graham Priest. I think two philosophers. I think this is a book on obviously morality and sexual harassment. It says sexual harassment is any form of sexual behavior by members of the dominant gender group. Notice now we have dominant towards members of a subordinate gender group. So one's got to be dominant, one's got to be subordinate, whose typical effect is to cause members of the subordinate group to experience their powerlessness as a member of the group. In our society, it is men who are the dominant gender group, and so only men can sexually harass. Okay, I guess this is they're having a debate as to who can sexually harass. The sixth one, let me see, comes from again the Equal Opportunity Commission guidelines on sex on discrimination, because of sex, and this one says that is unwelcome sexual advances, requests for sexual favors, and other verbal or physical content of a sexual nature constitutes sexual harassment when 1. Submission to such conduct is made explicitly or implicitly a term or condition of an individual's employment. 2. Submission to or rejection of such conduct by an individual issued as the basis for employment decisions affecting such an individual. Or 3. Such conduct has the purpose or effect of unreasonably interfering with an individual's work performance or creating an intimidating, hostile, or offensive work environment. Okay, another one. Notice a little bit more explicit about the kind of actions that are classified as sexual harassment. And finally, and this one comes from the University of Rochester, where Robert Holmes is a professor. They have a publication, Think Safe. It outlines campus security policies. And it says 7, sexual harassment ranges from sexual innuendo. Okay, innuendo is something that's kind of implied, to the creation of a hostile or intimidating environment, to coerced sexual relations. Examples of sexual harassment include sexually degrading words or gestures, offensive sexual graffiti, pictures or cartoons, subtle pressure for sexual activity, leering or ogling, disparaging remarks to a person about his or her gender or clothing, unnecessary touching, I'm wondering what necessary touching, patting, pinching, or brushing, stalking, telephone and or computer harassment, forced sexual contact, including sexual assault, rape, or date rape. Okay, again, that's from a university's campus security policies. Okay, notice they're really a range of criteria that are used to identify what sexual harassment is, and some of them seem in and of themselves to be a little bit problematic. And notice there are different things that count as sexual harassment, so there probably are, the moral evaluation that you make of various actions is probably slightly different depending on what the action that we're talking about is. But let's notice a few things. I have a few notes on these definitions, these characterizations of sexual harassment. Okay, number 1 and number 5. It's important to see, says sexual harassment occurs only in contexts of unequal power. Now ask yourself, is that true? That is, if it's unequal power, where's a case of unequal power? You might say, especially in the workplace, a manager, a boss, and the person that they supervise. That's unequal power. Now it says it only occurs in context of unequal power. Sometimes they even said that it has to be the dominant one. We'll get to in the next one. I think it said it had to be the person who has more power. I'm wondering how we measure this power. Does that mean that if somebody tells you, have sex with me, or I'm going to go make some accusations, basically blackmailing you, if that constitutes sexual harassment or not? It might very well. Okay, that was the first and the fifth. The second and the fifth says sexual harassment is only perpetrated against women. So if you're a man, you're just there, you can't be sexual harassed according to those characterizations. 3, 4, and 6 claim that sexual harassment only takes place in the workplace. Okay, so if you meet somebody on the street or you meet somebody in school, and let's say it's a classmate or something, it's not the workplace, so sexual harassment isn't occurring in those contexts. And what's interesting, 6 and 7, actually 7 does say something, but it's pretty vague. They give examples. They don't really say what it is. And obviously, some of these say if you are raping somebody, you're clearly having sex. And then the question is, what constitutes a rape? Can touching a person's arm or touching a person's hand, can that constitute rape? Can that constitute sexual harassment? These are some really tough questions to figure out. And obviously, different kinds of harassment. That is, if you know somebody, for example, somebody is a religious person and wants to avoid contact with members of the opposite sex. Maybe they're married and these are the rules that they wish to live on. Maybe just, tapping them on the arm to get their attention, is that good enough to constitute sexual harassment? Now, I don't know that I have any answers to these things. Some of them you'd say are clearly cases of sexual harassment. Some of them aren't. But if you notice, these are things that you've seen over the last 30, 40 years, definitions that have been proposed, and they all seem to be somewhat problematic, which is why it's really hard to try to identify what sexual harassment is. But in the context of sexual harassment, I think we can at least discuss, and especially in the context of the movie and what some of the situations that took place there, we can discuss whether certain things, well, first we might worry whether they constitute sexual harassment, or we might say, maybe this is sexual harassment. Is that something wrong? Notice in the movie we're talking about a legal concept and one that government regulates. Here, though, we have a broader definition. That is, there are certain things that the government might not let you do. For instance, in a country that has a state religion and a very conservative religion, there are things that we do every day here to members of the opposite sex, maybe members of the same sex, that in that context, in that other environment, would constitute sexual harassment. Here, it's not clear that it does. And I don't think you should jump off and say, well, you see, after all that stuff about cultural relativism, you see, it's all is relative. I think part of the problem is just defining what it is that we're talking about in sexual harassment. And if we had a decent definition, we'd be able to maybe weigh in on whether actions that are sexual harassment are morally wrong or not.